The first act of a screenplay does a ton of heavy lifting because it sets up everything that's to come. And it needs to do this super efficiently without being confusing or boring. Today, I'm going to give you some concrete tips on how to do that so that you can hook those Hollywood readers. I'm Nathan Graham Davis. I'm a Hollywood screenwriter living in Massachusetts, and this is class 9 of Delusional. If this is the first video that you've seen from this series, then congratulations, you have stumbled across a one-of-a-kind 15-week screenwriting course, and you don't have to pay me a thing for it. If you want to know more, go check out class 0, where you can find out if this is for you. If you're currently following along, then you have just completed the first 10 to 15 pages of your feature screenplay. Maybe that was easier than you expected, maybe it was harder, maybe it was a little bit of both, but I hope you had a lot of fun doing it. For many of you, this is your first screenplay, so I want to remind you that those pages do not need to be perfect. When you read a professional script, like the ones that you've been reading for this entire course, those have gone through many drafts, often like 10 or 20 or even more. So you're not seeing all the messy, imperfect work that it took to get there. But I promise you, it took a lot of it. And if those professionals took that many drafts to get it right, I hope that'll give you the confidence to just kind of get out of your own way a little bit and put some words down. You can always revise them later. 10 to 15 pages will be your weekly target right up until the end of this course. That's a good amount of writing, but you should find it doable as long as you plan ahead and make time. That's going to look different for everyone, but when I had a day job, I typically got in about 60 to 90 minutes of writing per weekday through a combination of getting up early and then also writing on my lunch breaks. On weekends, I'd aim for 2 to 3 hours per day. I've got kids, so again, this often meant getting up early. It was pretty common for me to miss my target 1 or 2 days a week, but I would still wind up with a good 7 to 10 hours of solid writing by the time that week was done. At an average of like 2 pages an hour, which is a pretty normal pace for me, that meant I was hitting around 14 to 20 pages per week. The biggest challenges I had keeping a schedule like that were, 1, that it did feel like a grind at times, and 2, without a deadline to keep me pressing forward, it was easy to get stuck on a section and just keep reworking it, instead of, just finishing a draft so that I had something that was actually worth revising. So that is the whole reason that this class has a timeline. First, you'll be done in less than 2 months, which isn't that far away. And second, the deadline should help you stay on pace, especially if your group works to support each other and hold each other accountable.
I'll support you 100%.
You are going to be tempted to go back and change things. You're going to have new ideas and you're going to veer off your outline, which means that some things in your earlier pages might not work anymore. All of that is super normal, and it'll be even more tempting since we're going to be covering new topics every single week. So here's my advice. When you realize that you need to change something, just make a note of it so that you won't forget. But don't go back and fix anything until you've gotten through that week's pages. That way you'll be sure to stay on pace. If you have extra time after you finish, that's great. Go back and make those changes. If not, you'll have that note as a reminder for when you dig into your rewrites. Anyway, let's jump into this week's topic, first act. A first act can often be broken down into 2 or 3 clear sections. The first, which is totally optional, is a teaser. These are typically 1 to 3 pages meant to hook us with a genre moment. So if it's a horror, it'll be a scary scene in which we often see or get a sense of a kill. Teasers don't need to include the protagonist, and they often don't, but they do typically introduce us to the primary antagonistic force, or at least give us a hint of them. The next section is basically just the introduction to the movie, which sets us up for the inciting incident. This section tends to run anywhere from 8 to 15 pages, and we talked about it a lot last week, since last week was all about the first 10. After the inciting incident, you have the section that we talked about in your one-pagers, which forces the protagonist into action. Again, this section usually runs around 8 to 15 pages. When you add all those up, you get around 18 to 30 pages for your first act, and most first acts tend to be a little bit closer to the longer side of that spectrum. If you remember the first 10 checklist from last week, you want to give us an introduction of your protagonist that gets us on board with them, helps us get to know them a little bit, and also makes us empathize with them. You want to set up your world and your tone and your genre, and you want to set up the inciting incident and make it clear why the protagonist is going to care about it. Remember, the inciting incident is usually a moment that turns the protagonist's world upside down. It often feels like it's either the best or the worst thing that could possibly happen to them at that time. We're going to keep using the scripts for Die Hard, Get Out, and Little Miss Sunshine this week, so go ahead and pause the video and open those up. The links are once again in the video's description. Since we did the first 10 last week, today we're mostly going to focus on forcing your protagonist into action, and I've made another checklist. I will put out the standard caveat that applies to most of what you'll learn in this course. Use this checklist and the other tools I'm giving you as a way to help you get to the finish line. But if something feels flat out wrong for your story, well, that could actually be the case. Nobody knows anything, and there are very few hard, fast rules in screenwriting. These are simply guidelines that apply to a large amount of Hollywood-style movies, and hopefully they'll help you a bit with your own. So the inciting incident has happened. Your protagonist feels either amazing or awful about it. Whatever it is that they're feeling, you need to find a way to show us that. This is critical to keeping us in their shoes. Ideally, you're doing this in a way that's more compelling and more visual than them just saying, "I'm mad about this," because that is boring. In Die Hard, whether you want to consider the events with John's wife the inciting incident, and I'd say that that is it, at least as far as his arc is concerned, or whether you want to consider it the moment when the terrorists arrive, John is not really a protagonist who wears his emotions on his sleeve. But when he meets Ellis and Ellis slips up and calls Holly John's ex-wife, John talks a little passive-aggressive shit to him, and he shows us exactly what he thinks of him.
Miss Summit.
And he tells Holly what he thinks of Ellis too. And when Holly suggests that he stay over and then leaves the room, John smiles to himself a little bit because his goal is to salvage their relationship, and that is at least a start. When the terrorists arrive and fire their first shots, John immediately gets a look and takes out his gun, switching off the safety. He knows how bad the situation is right away, and we know he's ready for action. But he's still looking for an easier way out. His first move is just to try and find a working phone. Unfortunately, all those lines have been cut, and we see that he's pretty concerned when he discovers this. On page 18 in the script, where after he picks up another line and finds that it's down, he looks out a window to a high-rise apartment nearby and sees a woman pick up a phone. The script specifically calls out that it seems so easy, and that's when John first tells himself to think. It's a subtle way of helping us understand exactly how John feels about the situation he's in. In Get Out, we know that Chris is already nervous about meeting Rose's parents, and when we find out that they don't even know he's black, that just exacerbates those feelings. He tries to have a cigarette, but Rose won't let him because her parents hate smokers. And so although he's doing his best to handle the pressure, we feel it. In Little Miss Sunshine, they get a voicemail that Olive has a chance to compete in the Little Miss Sunshine pageant. Richard barely registers it because he was hoping for a different call, and he walks away and forgets about it until it's brought up at dinner when Richard is gloating to Frank about how Olive's attitude makes her a winner. He's just doing this to underscore his own belief system. But when he remembers the message and brings it up, they listen to it, and we see Olive scream with happiness on page 20. This, in a way, is the inciting incident for the characters. That is super late for an inciting incident. It is damn near second act time now. But Michael Arndt did something very smart here. He let us hear that message on page 8 so that we'd be clued into the inciting incident at a much more appropriate time. That knowledge created some extra dramatic tension as the following pages played out, even if the characters hadn't heard it yet. As for how Richard feels about all this, well, he's got other things on his mind, like the sale of his business idea and their very real money troubles. Olive is overjoyed, and he doesn't even consider that joy. He just tells Olive to finish her dinner as she runs past him screaming.
Finish your dinner!
I'm finished!
And when he finds out that the pageant is this coming Sunday, he's not interested in taking her, and he asks Cheryl if there's another way to get her there, and she begins making suggestions that all sound super expensive. Okay, so now we know how your protagonist feels, and that's great. So what are they gonna do? You need to introduce a goal. As we've talked about, the goal is typically something that will get them what they want in response to or as a result of the inciting incident. Sometimes it's something that they believe will improve their life. Often it's something that they believe will return them to their status quo. Either way, it needs to be there. In Die Hard, the goal is crystal clear. Holly is a hostage and John needs to get her to safety. In Get Out, it's more subtle, but it's all there. It's very clear how much Rose's parents mean to her. She hasn't seen them in 10 months, which is the longest she's ever been away, and she wants them to like Chris. Chris absolutely adores Rose, and because she wants him to meet them, he wants to do that for her. But he's the first black boyfriend she's ever had, and he knows this is new territory for her parents, so what's his goal? It's simple. It's to get through the weekend and make Rose's parents feel good about him as her partner, all for the purpose of making Rose happy. In Little Miss Sunshine, we get there fast, and part of that is because for the characters, the inciting incident happens quite late. Olive is overjoyed, and her goal is clear: go compete in the Little Miss Sunshine pageant. Or at least that seems like her goal, but that evolves a little in the coming pages, which we will get to in a minute. But either way, she's adorably excited, and she's already packing, and soon Richard can't even ignore that. But the only affordable way to get her there is if he drives her and the entire family in their beater of a VW bus 800 miles to the contest. And that is a fantastic goal to carry us through the second act. Often, before they decide to act, a protagonist will push back on the idea of pursuing that goal. This is common enough that sometimes this section is called the refusal of the call to action. There are obstacles and barriers in the protagonist's way, and they either don't want to or aren't convinced that they can overcome them. Some obstacles they almost certainly don't know about yet, but others are clear from the outset. And that's important because if you want to hook your reader, they need to understand why this goal will be such a challenge. Some movies reveal obstacles to the audience well before they reveal them to the protagonist. Others keep us in that protagonist's point of view the entire time so that we only learn things as they do. Both choices have their strengths and both are equally valid, but what is pretty much true every time is that you want to tip your audience off to at least a few things that are going to cause them to struggle. This section is a great place to do that. Also, if you run out of steam in Act 2 or at the end of Act 3, it's typically because you didn't set up enough potential for conflict in the first act. In Die Hard, we watch as the building and parking garage doors are locked down. No one's getting out. We meet all 12 terrorists and we see how ruthless they are in the way that they kill the guard, and then even more so as Hans kills Takagi. We watch them cut out the phone lines. We get a clear look at how smart Hans is. We learn that John won't even be able to use the fire alarm system in order to alert the authorities. From the first act alone, we know that he and the hostages are trapped and on their own up there. In Get Out, we learn how much Rose loves her parents and how much Chris loves Rose, and this is only solidified when she backs him up in front of a racist cop.
I didn't ask who was driving. I asked to see his ID.
Yeah, why? That doesn't make any sense.
Here.
No. Fuck that. You don't have to give him your ID because you haven't done anything wrong.
He is not going to want to let her down this weekend. But also, before we meet Rose's parents, as she drives onto their property, we see how remote and secluded it is. That's not great if something goes wrong, and the movie has told us that something probably will, because we already saw that teaser where some dude in a night helmet shot a dart at Andre and dragged him into the trunk of a car. As Rose pulls in, Chris sees that they have a black groundskeeper. And he seems kind of off. It's a little unsettling, and also his employment there has a slightly potentially racist The Help type vibes. And then, still outside their home, we get a quick intro to Rose's parents, Dean and Missy. They seem nice, but they're also a little awkward. It's possible that this is going to be a really long weekend, and Chris isn't even allowed to have the things that calm him down most, his cigarettes. In Little Miss Sunshine, we're setting up a bunch of things. We've set up Richard's dogma and his intense hatred of losing. We know that Cheryl isn't fully on board with Richard's win at all costs mentality. We also know that she can't drive the VW bus. We know that Frank is a potential liability because he's at risk of attempting suicide and that he and Richard don't like each other. And we know that Grandpa is a potential liability because of his drug use and his brash manner, and also that he doesn't fully buy into what his son is selling. Dwayne hates everyone and he won't talk to them. On Olive's part, we've already been told that she doesn't look like most beauty pageant contestants, and we are beginning to get a sense that her dad's mentality may be toxic. These are all great barriers. You are going to set up a lot of things in the first act, but one other thing that writers often set up in a way that's sneaky and incredibly satisfying is they set up a way for the protagonist to win. It doesn't have to be, but often this is not just a tool or some special ability of theirs, but it's also a symbol or a metaphor that's related to their arc. In Die Hard, we see John's gun, sure. We meet Sergeant Powell, who helps him, that's great. These are things that are critical to John succeeding, and it is important that they're set up in the first act, but there's something here that's a whole lot more subtle and a lot more meaningful, and it elevates Die Hard. And that's the watch that Ellis gave to Holly.
Show him the watch.
When we find out about it on page 11, it's just a small detail that's symbolic of Holly's career success, but also of the growing distance between her and John. And that's why, despite it being a subtle detail, the writers call attention to it again a couple pages later when John mentions it to Holly in private, because it really feels that innocuous and they wanted to hang a lantern on it. And as you probably already know, this watch is actually a brilliant setup. After a second act full of fighting and heroic efforts and narrow escapes, and John also coming to the full realization of how much of an idiot he was with his wife, we get to the climax in Act 3. Hans falls out a window and grabs onto Holly's arm, and her watch band is the only thing keeping him from falling to his death. John reaches down and helps release the watch band, and Hans and the watch both fall into the void. Not only has John won against Hans, but the watch falling away also symbolizes how the barriers between him and Holly have been dissolved. In Get Out, on page 13, while they're on their way to Rose's parents' house, she and Chris hit a deer. Chris follows it into the woods and watches it die. And at this point in the script, it seems like nothing more than a jump scare to just keep us reminded that we're not watching a drama, this is a horror flick. And by the way, hitting those genre moments every 10 to 15 pages is important. But the deer is so much more than that. First of all, not long after meeting Rose's dad, who seems pretty okay, if a little over the top and corny, they mention the deer that they hit, and Rose's dad goes on a rant about how the deer are vermin that are taking over. That is foreshadowing for his racist attitudes that we'll learn about later. But much more importantly, we learn in the second act that Chris's mom died in a hit-and-run accident when he was a kid, and he might have been able to save her if he'd simply called 911. But he didn't, and he blames himself for her death. And this deer is a reminder of that. And then, when we get to the third act and Chris is strapped to a chair not far from getting his skull cut open and having a brain transplant, he's in a game room and there's a mounted deer head on the wall. Chris gets free and uses that deer head to kill Rose's dad by sticking him with its antlers. It's symbolism of his growth as a character, how he's learned to take action and move beyond his trauma. And it's also extra satisfying because the racist dad hates deer. In Little Miss Sunshine, the moment that completes the arcs for Olive and especially for Richard is when she's up on stage doing her totally unexpected and hilarious dance routine. People are getting pissed off and Richard knows she's not going to win, but what does he tell the head of the pageant committee?
Kicking ass.
It's a wonderful, emotionally satisfying moment, and then he gets up there with her and he dances with her and he affirms her, and Olive knows for certain now that winning is far more about being herself and having fun doing it. But for that secret dance routine to work, it needs to be set up and it needs to feel fair to the audience. On page 6 and 7, we're in Cheryl's point of view as she bustles around to get Frank set up in his room with Dwayne and also to get dinner on the table. She yells downstairs to Olive and asks what she's doing, and Olive yells back that she's rehearsing with Grandpa. And because we're in Cheryl's point of view and she's focused on other things, we pay about as much attention to this as she does, which is not much. It's kind of like when a magician uses sleight of hand and misdirects us by focusing on something else entirely. And what's great is Michael Arndt even does this again by having Richard ask Grandpa how the routine is. Grandpa replies that it's okay, but it needs polish. Just like with The Watch and Die Hard, this extra moment hangs a lantern on that setup, and maybe it makes us a little curious, but importantly, we don't get to focus on it for long. The exchange is buried between Olive asking Frank, who just tried to kill himself, what happened to his wrists. And you know, that's an awkwardly tense moment. And then on the other side of Grandpa mentioning the dance routine, Grandpa quickly freaks out about having chicken for dinner again. Our curiosity about the routine is cast aside for other things, but it'll be ready for us at the end when it becomes important. At some point, the first act has to end. Sometimes this is subtle and we don't even catch the transition on the first viewing. Sometimes it's clear as day because the protagonist literally enters an entirely different world. But regardless, almost always, the protagonist makes some kind of clear decision to act and pursue a goal. And that brings us into what becomes the real meat of the movie. In Die Hard, John doesn't want to fight. That's not why he came to LA. He came here to save his marriage and he wants the easiest, safest way out of that conflict. But being a cop, he needs to make sure that everyone else is safe too. So first, he tries to call someone, but the phones are down. Then he pulls the fire alarm, but when the fire trucks start coming, he watches as they turn around due to Hans and his men calling them off. Tony, one of the terrorists, stalks John and says out loud that no one is coming to help them. John's already seen how ruthless they are. He saw Hans murder Takagi in cold blood, and so he has two choices: give up and either be killed or become a hostage himself, or he can fight back. Great, he's obviously going to fight back, but how do we show that he's made that decision? Well, it's done in two ways. First, Tony, that terrorist, tells John that John won't kill him because John's a cop. We know John's job is important to him. He stayed in New York to keep doing it, and he's been doing it for 13 years. But what's his response? Try me. And then he kills him. And that tells us exactly what John's willing to do. Next, after he kills him, he sends Tony's body down in the elevator with a note that says, "Now I have a machine gun." It's a very specific and decisive challenge to Hans. And when Hans reads this aloud, there's no question John has made the decision to fight back. This happens on page 29, which is right on target to move into Act 2. In Little Miss Sunshine, on page 24, Richard realizes he's going to need to drive everyone in order to make this work, and so he decides to do exactly that. And immediately he realizes this is a chance to impart his beliefs about winning into his family, and most importantly, into his young daughter. On page 25, he tells Olive there's no point in going unless she believes she's going to win, and he gets her to affirm that she's going to do exactly that. And now Olive has also made an active decision. She's not just going to go to compete, she's going to compete to win in order to earn her dad's approval. That is now Olive's goal. Richard slaps the table and says, "We're going to Florida," and with that, we move into the second act and we're in the bus on page 26. In Get Out, Chris is put into a position where he could easily move into the second act in a way that's passive. He's been driven by his girlfriend to her mom's house, he's there on their front porch, and yeah, maybe it's a little awkward and unsettling at this point, but what's he gonna do? Mortify his girlfriend and destroy his relationship by saying he doesn't want to stay the weekend after all? That would be pretty extreme. He could just walk inside now, but that's not quite what happens. If you go to page 18 of the script, which is early by the way, but not unheard of, they're on the Armitage's porch and Dean is telling Chris how they're huggers, and Missy is feeling Chris's biceps and saying how handsome he is, and it is awkward. Missy has never met him and she's flat out invading his personal space, and Rose asks them to stop embarrassing her, and Jordan Peele does something very smart here. After Missy invites them inside, he has Chris say, "I'm fine with embarrassing, by the way, go ahead." And it's only then that they enter the house. Chris has made an active decision here to embrace the way that they've put him on this awkward pedestal in order to make the weekend go as smoothly as possible, all for the sake of Rose. And that decision is what's going to get him into trouble, because at least for a little while, he's going to continue ignoring all these red flags. Interestingly, this is structured pretty differently in the movie. The script and the movie are very close in a number of ways, but they actually get to Rose's parents' house much earlier in the movie, something like 13 minutes in. And the scene on the porch is filmed from far away in a way that's both unsettling and awkward, but we don't really hear the dialogue, and the line of Chris's that I just mentioned doesn't happen at all. Instead, there's a new scene at around 27 or 28 minutes after they've spent the afternoon there, and Chris has experienced some weird microaggressions. Chris and Rose are in her bedroom, and Rose is apologizing, and Chris is reaffirming that he wants to stay because he loves her, and that it's going to be okay, and then they go to sleep. In the movie, this feels more like the active decision to move into Act 2 because they're acknowledging some weird racist undercurrents and Chris is saying that it's okay. And it totally works, although I do kind of like the way it's done in the script because when Chris enters the house on page 19, it does have this whole, entering a wild new world feeling to him. And as he gets the tour of the mansion, he mentions how he grew up in a one-bedroom home. But both ways work, the script is great and the movie is also great. And also, it's a useful example of two things. The first is how even the same exact story can be approached in multiple ways that work. This becomes super apparent when you start working with producers, executives, and directors. There are many things about Aftermath that are way different than how I would have written them, but it still found an audience and it hit #1 on Netflix. The second thing is that, although it can be useful to try and figure out how the sausage is made, sometimes movie structure is not crystal clear, and people might even disagree on where exactly these act breaks fall. I've had producers refer to my own act breaks as moments that I didn't consider to be those act breaks at all. If there were truly such a thing as a perfect formula out there, there'd be no point to you taking this class, because there'd be no more need for writers and AI would actually be capable of producing great scripts, which it's not. We should study these things, but we also need to know enough to know that each story has its own idiosyncrasies, and at the end of the day, it all comes down to you telling a great story. Okay, so clearly you're going to be trying to pack a lot into those first 20 to 30 pages. You're going to need to be really efficient and economical to pull this off, and as I said in the last class, readers like a lot of white space anyway. But never sacrifice clarity for the sake of economy. Confusing your reader is one of the worst things that you can possibly do, and it's especially tragic if you actually did put in all the necessary setup, but simply didn't highlight it enough or make it clear enough for them to understand what you were doing. In your first draft, try not to worry too much about overwriting. If your first act winds up being 35 pages and your script winds up being 125, that's totally fine. You can go back and trim those things later. It's better to make sure that you're capturing everything in a way that's clear up front. Clarity is also a big reason why feedback and multiple drafts are necessary, because it's very easy to be unclear about things without realizing that you're doing it. Speaking of things that we want to be clear on and which we might spend a few more words or lines than normal, let's look at character introductions. Most screenplays see the introduction of several characters in the first act, and these introductions are an opportunity to convey something really important to the reader. There are two parts to a character introduction. The first is the way that you describe them in your action lines, and the second is what they do when we first meet them. And as you might have guessed, the second part is by far the most important because it's what's going to wind up on screen. But that first part can help us understand how to read their actions and their dialogue, both here and elsewhere, and it's also an opportunity for us to get excited about watching them. If you go to the first page of Die Hard, you'll see that John is described as mid-30s, good-looking, and tired from his trip. He sits by the window. His relief on landing is subtle, but we notice. All right, let's break that down real quick. First of all, we get his age. This is something you want to give us almost every single time for every character, except maybe for the tiniest of roles. It's important for casting, but it also helps us visualize them more easily, and it tells us at least a little bit about where they are in life. John's also described as good-looking. That's actually kind of outdated. These days, it's a little frowned upon to call out a character's good looks, especially if they're women, unless it's important to the story. The reason is that it's become such a cliche, and especially with women, introductions describing looks were favored over introductions that actually told us something interesting and useful about them. So aim for interesting and useful. Athletic is totally reasonable though. John's going to be an action hero, so he probably should be athletic. Then we find out that he's tired from his trip. That's also useful to know, because that's going to inform how we read his coming lines. And finally, we find out that he's relieved to be landing. That's interesting. This is not somebody who's 100% stoic and fearless. He's a little bit uncomfortable. But what about his neighbor? He was simply described as a middle-aged businessman. A guy with only a couple lines of dialogue. It wasn't worth spending the extra lines of a script describing him. And that also telegraphs something to us as readers. We don't need to pay a lot of attention to this guy. We just need to focus on John. Next, let's talk about how John's introduced on screen. You can pack as much detail as you like into your action lines, but if you don't also show the audience who the character is, they're unlikely to care much. So we meet John, and he's kind of uninterested in this guy who's next to him, who's just super talkative, and it tells us that John might be more of a practical, brass tacks kind of guy. And then we see his gun, which is interesting. And when his neighbor gets a little freaked out by that, John not only says that he's a cop, but he turns the guy's own "trust me" line on him in a way that's kind of fun and witty. So now we're quickly getting an idea of who he is. When we meet Hans and his henchmen, the henchmen don't get a lot of time spent on their intros and the action lines. It's just not necessary. On screen, their first introduction is compelling, and that's important because we do want to know that we're dealing with some real badasses here. But unlike them, to show both the reader and the audience that Hans is the guy that we really need to pay attention to, Hans gets introduced with some gravitas on page 15. The doors to his service elevator open to reveal Hans Gruber, impeccably dressed, lean and handsome. He steps out into the lobby like he owns the building, and in a way, he does. It's cinematic the way the elevator doors open to reveal him. But second, we instantly get that we are not dealing with some stock villain here. The two words impeccably dressed speak volumes, as does the way that he's described as he steps into the lobby. He goes to cross the lobby and lock the front doors, looking over the quiet city, once again as if he owns it. We get the feeling that this man is completely in control, and it's effective writing, and it's also efficient. Only a few lines are spent to give us all that information, and it's also much more interesting than if the writers had used a couple lines of dialogue to try and convey all that same stuff. Pause the video now, or take a minute at the end to go through the major introductions in Get Out and Little Miss Sunshine, and see what you can glean from them by considering why the writers chose to introduce them in that way. Remember to not only look for the lines on the page, but also the first actions and/or dialogue from that character. How do they enter the scene and show up on screen? Audiences love a great intro, and guess what? So do the actors who you want to play these parts. All right, last but not least for first act stuff, let's talk about Chekhov's gun for a second. You may have heard about this before. Anton Chekhov, the renowned playwright and short story author, said, "If you say in the first chapter that there is a rifle hanging on the wall, in the second or third chapter it absolutely must go off." And I think it's kind of interesting that even true masters have guidelines that they subscribe to. We are talking about setups and payoffs here. And in movies, because of how they're structured, that gun is typically going to go off in the second act and sometimes in the third instead of the second and third chapters. But still, it had better go off. But here's the part of that quote that's often forgotten. In the words preceding the most famous part of this quote, Chekhov said, "Remove everything that has no relevance to the story." This is true in all writing, but it's especially true in movies. If you include something that feels like it could be a setup and then don't pay it off, you're going to disappoint your audience. And by the way, this is not just about guns and weapons. It's basically any interesting detail that you include and call attention to, and that can even be a bit of dialogue. For instance, that fists with your toes dialogue on page 1 of Die Hard, which pays off in a fantastic way. Or how about that deer that Rose hits on page 13 of Get Out? If those moments weren't paid off, those movies would have been less satisfying. Most people have seen a lot of movies. They love setups and payoffs, and they expect them. Even if it's subconscious, they're watching for them, and they're paying close attention to things that they feel like might have been planted for later use. They of course want to be surprised by the way in which we do these things, but either way they want us to do it, so mess with those expectations at your peril. Basically, just be careful about including any extraneous details that could come across as setups. In your first draft, this isn't a big deal. In fact, I regularly write in details that I'm not sure are relevant, and then I surprise myself by finding the perfect way to use them later. That's totally okay. It's part of the magic of writing. But if it doesn't end up informing the character or the story in a meaningful way, or you don't end up using it by the end of the script, you're probably going to want to reduce its significance in your rewrites. So that's it for week 9. As usual, if you have questions, go ahead and ask them in the comments. I'll answer at least some of them here, and I may use others as topics for future videos. Also, as usual, here's a quick reminder about the cost of the course. Now more than ever, do the work. This is not a free class. You are paying yourself. This is an investment in you. If you can stay on track for just 6 more classes, you'll have completed the first draft of an entire feature screenplay. And if you want to celebrate your accomplishment with a bit of delusional merch, you gotta earn it. You gotta finish. The other cost of this course is to pay it forward. If you're getting something out of it, share the course with others. If you haven't done this yet, you're still with me on class 9, so I'm gonna bet you're getting some value out of it. So please pay the cost of the course and share it with others. And do the like and subscribe thing too, because it costs you nothing and it tells YouTube to show this to more people. As for assignments this week, they're pretty simple. First and foremost, write your 10 to 15 pages. By sticking with this for your second week in a row, you'll finish your first act or come very close to it, and that's a huge accomplishment. It's not easy to write a screenplay, which is why most people will never do it, but you are on track to finishing yours. So budget your time accordingly, because some weeks you'll have more time than others. Take advantage of the weeks where you do have it. And if you do finish your first act this week, you should celebrate in some way. Go get ice cream, go out to dinner, do something, and I would love to hear how you celebrated in the comments. Your next assignment is to read the script for Toy Story 3 if you haven't already. This was referenced in the Michael Arndt video I assigned a few weeks ago, and now that we've talked extensively about the first act, I'd love for you to read it and pay close attention to how the first act sets up character arcs and the ending. The link is in the description below, and if you have read Toy Story 3, then just pick another script from the list of 20 and try and pay attention to the same thing. And that's it. I'll see you in week 10.